The visual too?
What?
It
Yeah,
indicates that it is being recorded.
Jay does it. It includes the visual.
That'd be great.
Yeah, it should record the same screen that you're looking at now. And
Okay, Lori, could you shut your camera, please?
Yeah, sure. I thought you asked him to put on.
at this
Normally,
point,
I want everybody's camera on, but right now we need the bandwidth.
Got
so
it.
we're going to be talking about the EEG, which is the summation of the excitatory presynaptic and postsynaptic potentials that, not the action potentials of the discharges in the brain, but the excitatory pre and postsynaptic potentials, the slow gradations. And when they're all added up, they make oscillations. And the oscillations basically are alternating current signals, AC signals, because they go up and down across time. And the AC EEG is assumed to be kind of an ongoing rhythm of the brain. And it's full of little episodes where the brain is responding to stimuli from outside. And if you look at the response to an individual stimulus, it's a little itty tiny bitty signal, and it's embedded in top of all the EEG chaos, and you don't see the individual responses. But the EEG is full of event-related potentials, the brain responding to sensory inputs. On rare occasion, as you go through the EEG, you may end up seeing something that looks like it happened in a widespread manner. You can see the little event at the back of the head here. This is called lambda, the little sharp potential at the back of the head. And it's actually a visual event-related potential. Something became fixed on the retina. Every time you pop one of these lambda waves in the back of the head, what it is a single visual event-related potential. So the EEG is full of the responses like this to single images, but it's also full of ongoing rhythms. And typically, the individual responses aren't visually discernible because they're embedded in so much background rhythm. So you might have a 50 to 100 microvolt rhythm going, and you've got a 5 or 10 microvolt signal as the response to a stimulus, and they just kind of are averaged in and you don't see them. So the EEG is essentially full of ERPs, but we don't see them as event-related potentials because they're small and they're not averaged up. So in order to see the small potentials, we've got to get rid of the background EEG. Now, you can see that the EEG, if we pick any point in time, it may be going up or down. And if we picked small segments and averaged them, there'd be some times when the EEG was going up and sometimes it was going down. And over time, the EEG averages out. And as such, if we give a series of stimuli and we time lock a recorder to the presentation of the stimulus, we can then actually get the response to a stimulus. Now, the response to these stimulus end up being easily visible. These are go, no-go potentials. And this is essentially a continuous performance task with 100 performances averaged together. So the EEG averages out, and the response to the stimuli actually average up. This is a go stimulus where the person was presented with a stimulus that meant he should hit the button. And you can see a funny little waveform here kind of centrally. In the no-go, which is this display, you can see it's slightly anteriorized, but you see a widespread, very complex waveform with lots of little bits to it that go from essentially time 0 when the stimulus is presented to about 400 milliseconds. And what we have here is the go, no-go potential, which is, again, the brain's response to being told it should hit the button, and here's a no-go where it's been shown a stimulus where you should suspend hitting the button and not hit it. Now, this particular task is a primed go, no-go task, which is a continuous performance task with a warning that you're about to get a stimulus. And the warning is a first stimulus. The first stimulus, essentially, this is a really simple task, Two kinds of visual stimuli, animals and plants. So it can be given to any age. You don't have to be verbal, you just have to be visual. And they're not tricked. I mean, it's not like a green animal standing there like a plant or something. These are distinctly animals and plants, and they're black and white. And it's easy to identify which is which. If the first stimulus is an animal, you may have to respond to the next stimulus. If the first stimulus is a plant, you will not respond to the next stimulus. So it's a primed stimulus with a warning as to whether you have to respond or not. If the second stimulus is an animal, you hit the button. If it's a plant, you don't. So it's a little bit of a complex task, and you have to hold the response, the instruction set, animals and plants, and if it's an animal at first, you might have to hit the button, but only if it's an animal the second time. So that instruction set has to be held in your brain. The spot in the brain that holds these models of how you should be behaving is the anterior cingulate. Now, when we start to present stimuli, they actually have a fairly standardized way of occurring. And that complex waveform is actually a summation of all of these waveforms, some of them occurring fairly early, some of them occurring late. And the early one is stimulus detection. I mean, it's a visual stimulus, and the back of the head receives about 100 milliseconds in the arrival of the visual stimulus. That stimulus is then processed across the dorsal and ventral processing streams, and that's a little bit more latent, but it's still fairly early. This is an auditory oddball. Every once in a while, the task tosses out an oddball tone as a distractor. And this is early, like a sensory stimulus, but auditory stimuli are actually picked up on the top of the head. And you might go, well, that's not where the auditory cortex is. What the hell are you doing up there? These potentials are picked up because the auditory cortexes are enfolded into the temporal-parietal junction, and they're both pointed up to the top of the head. So you see the potential on the surface up here, even though the source is buried into the temporal-parietal junction. Auditory potential can see at the vertex. So sensory detection, sensory processing, another kind of sensory detection, but this is auditory. And then this is the motor engagement. This is motor inhibition. And this is, did I do the task right or not? Self-monitoring. And we can watch the progress of this stimulus all the way through to the motor response or lack of motor response if you're supposed to inhibit, and then whether the person sees their response as being a correct response or if they get what's essentially a mismatch, which is an error code. So you watch the perception, the processing, the motor engagement or inhibition, and the awareness of whether the response was correct or not, all within 400 milliseconds. And these components actually have, this is what it would look like on a surface map. This is the waveform, but they have sources, and the sources can be plotted. And the final source here, although it looks like it's widespread, it's because it's deep. This is the anterior cingulate. And the anterior cingulate is where you hold the model of how you should have been responding. So when we look at the EEG, it's full of event-related potentials of this little wavelet and this little wavelet and this little wavelet. All these little wavelets are added in as instantaneous waveforms, but they're really small. This is only a few microvolts. I mean, it's very, very small. And as such, again, the individual responses are not seen. but when you add them together, they end up adding up, not averaging out. Now, there is an interaction between the event-related potential, which here is seen as the oddball P300. Pardon my dog for a moment here. Sam, that's enough. Go on. He's got to have the last word. My apologies for the interruption. What we see here is the interaction between the background alpha frequency and the arrival time of the P300, the positive deflection at about 300 microvolts, excuse me, at about 300 milliseconds, that occurs after you can detect the difference between two stimuli. So you've been given a series of stimuli, and suddenly one of them is different, and the brain responds to that difference. And that difference wave basically happens at about 300 milliseconds. If your alpha is fast, it occurs earlier. If your alpha is normal, intermediate, and if your alpha is slow, it's much more latent or late, basically. And this is a basic processing speed. Your background alpha frequency is literally turning on and off your perceptions. When your alpha goes, using the cursor here as a chalkboard, when the alpha goes electronegative or up in EEG land, your thalamus is open, stimuli are going in. As it goes electropositive to the dip of the alpha, at the very trough of the alpha waveform, your perception's actually turned off momentarily. Alpha parses your perception into discrete packets. And your alpha frequency is how many of these snapshots you're taking per second. So faster alpha is a higher resolution, slower alpha, lower resolution. And it has to do with your basic processing speed. How many cycles per second is the speed of your processing. Individuals with slow alpha and a delayed P300 can achieve more time in school. You actually can get an accommodation for being slow, basically. They don't shave time off if you're fast. So if your alpha's fast, you just get a little extra time. Anyway, the basic relationship here has been established, but only anecdotally. This is observed data, but it's not a publication. And actually, one of the students is going to be collecting data where they correlate alpha frequency and ERP latency as a dissertation. Perfectly good topic. Nobody's really published about it. So this is data that supports it, but again, this is not gone through peer review and publication. This is just observation. The basic interaction between your rhythmic background and your event-related potentials is very complex. And when we assess the ERPs, we can actually identify individuals that have sensory processing problems and differentiate them from people that have executive engagement or memory problems where they can't remember the instruction set. So the ERP analysis here is using the independent components to break it down into its component parts. The ICA has been used on the ERP. Yuri Kropotov has an entire book about that, and he received a prize for science. It's a Russian prize for science, equivalent to the Nobel Prize in the West, but it basically applied the ICA to the EEG and ERP, and it turned out to be a very good match. The ERP basically ends up identifying step by step how the brain is processing the signal and the motor responses and the comparison to recollection of the instruction sets. This gives us a great deal of detail about the response. There are a few different kinds of ERP tests that can be given. You can obviously do a visual continuous performance task like this. You could do it with auditory information, an auditory event-related potential. You can do it with somatosensory information, the sense of touch. You can do it with cognitive, the difference between two stimuli. And as such, there are lots of ways to set these up. The important thing is, if you are trying to test them, you have to use the exact setup. Not kind of the same, not generally the same, but precisely the same. Exactly the same interstimulus interval, the same distance from the screen, thus the radius of the image in your visual field, the same luminosity of the image, the complexity of the image. You can't have one image with more line density than the next. So all these things are controlled within the stimulus presentation here. If you alter those, you get alterations of these responses. Now, this also has a database because they've collected about 1,000 people with this response. So they have norms given the very tight constraints of how this is done. If you do it differently, you'd have to collect new norms or just look at the waveforms, locations, and generators and not look at how they compare to a normative database. But the normative database is always nice. You can not only see changes in the latency, which would be associated with a deviation from normal, but also a deviation in the topographic distribution of the generator. So this kind of a breakdown ends up being really quite useful. There are times when brain damage in an area ends up standing out very, very well in the ERP. Now, EEG in traumatic brain injury is sensitive to change, but it's not specific. And as such, it's not considered diagnostic typically. And although there are people within the neurofeedback field and QEEG field that will argue vociferously about it, the EEG is in the American Academy of Neurology and International Federation of Clinical Neurophysiology. They say it's very sensitive to the changes, but it's not diagnostically specific. Now, event-related potentials, on the other hand, are considered diagnostically specific. They will show you where in the brain the delay in the reception or the absence of the response actually is. So the ERP is considered diagnostically useful. In fact, it's diagnostically specific, or TBI, showing the actual location of the damage and nature of the damage. You could obviously end up seeing whether there was a sensory detection or processing or motor engagement, exactly what step was off and where, very nicely. So the EEG and ERP together end up being a very nice match, because the ERP, is diagnostically useful as it is, doesn't tell us how to treat the patient. It just diagnostically tells us where everything is. And the QEEG may be diagnostically non-specific, but it gives us great advice as to how and when and where to intervene. So we can develop our protocol and track our changes and everything with the QEEG, but we have to have the ERP for diagnosis. And if you collect them both, and the ERP is essentially just an extended period of the EEG being recorded during the continuous performance task. So you get the behavioral performance, how many omissions, how many commissions, what kind of error was there, what was the reaction time, and what's the variability in the reaction time. And they only do first half, second half. They don't have quartile variability like the IVA or TOVA might. But they basically give you a behavioral performance with norms that are age matched, pulled from the performance of the database participants. So you end up with a real good functional evaluation of the EEG, because you're not just looking at the background EEG rhythm, what's the standing waves of the background rhythm, what state does the brain hold, but you're actually looking at how that brain is processing information on a very specific task. Now, there are a lot of people that in QEEG do tasks, but the tasks very seldom have norms, and if they do, the task itself is usually very non-constrained. I mean, it's mental math, but what age group? I mean, when was the last time your fourth grader did a quadratic equation? You know, you can't give the math task to an adult that you would give to a kid, and you can't give the kid's task to an adult and expect it to actually task them with the same kind of a load. So the tasks that are out there, reading, mental math, that sort of thing, 0-7s, those are very poorly constrained tasks. They do generally bring out rhythmic abnormalities, but they're not necessarily a well-constrained task. There are those that have databases that don't have tasks in them that claim that tasks create so much variability that we can't do them and get a database, when in fact it's actually been shown that tasks constrain the otherwise fairly random choices the brain might have as to what state to be in. And tasks actually reduce variability. The at rest has a lot of variability because there's no constraint on what you do when you're sitting there told to rest. There are some people that do eyes closed meditation, and that's not eyes closed resting. It's not the same thing. So the argument that task is too much variability is in fact disproven by Alan Gevins and the EEG systems group back in the 80s. So it's really not a proper argument. The groups that have done tasks as ERPs, which for databases, the Brain Resource Company in Australia has ERPs in their norms, and they have about 2,000 normal people in the database and about 10,000 different clinical groupings. Not at 10,000 each group, but 10,000 total in a bunch of different clinical groups. The Russian database obviously has norms as well, the HBI database, and that database is now being replicated in Korea. They have 800 norms collected on their way to 2,000, 1,000 male, 1,000 female. Now, you might think because the databases assume male and female to be identical somehow, they group them, you might think that that's okay. However, it's not. Actually, between age 6 and age 21, there's a huge maturational developmental trajectory that's going on. And when you look at the development, you basically end up seeing males and females with different phases. They're out of phase. And if you take one waveform and another waveform, they're out of phase, and you combine them, what do you get? A flat line. It's not a distribution you want to be compared to. What's it, a unique database? I mean, come on. We know better, but the commercial databases would have to have twice as many people in them, and that means that they group male and female together. The current data that's being collected in Korea show dramatic differences male versus female. And, NIH just started to mandate male and female both be in the studies or they won't fund them, which is a little after the fact. I mean, I think we knew there was a difference a long time ago. We're just now starting to be honest with ourselves about the need to actually look at both male and female responses and look at them separately. You also need to look at cultural differences. The QEEG norms have been shown to be normal is normal is normal, whether you're in the Aleutian Islands with an Alaskan Aboriginal, or you're in New Zealand, or anywhere with another Aboriginal group. There's no racial group that has been shown to have a different set of norms. So normal is normal is normal across races and cultures. Now, ERP, on the other hand, the latency, overall latency is normal is normal is normal. But the processing style, you can see this, for instance, has a left side emphasis. This is the the normative distribution in the European database. The South Koreans have a bilateral balance between their processing. It's a different style. It's not normal, abnormal. The latency is not different. Their behavioral responses are not different than everything, but they have a balanced response. And they think this is cultural. They're collecting a cohort of genetically Korean kids that were raised from birth in Europe, and they'll then compare whether this is cultural versus genetic. And they don't believe it's genetic, but there is obviously a different gene pool between South Korea and largely Switzerland and Russia. So until they actually prove it, there are those that might argue that it may be racially based. But again, it's our belief that this is simply a cultural thing that developed with respect to how language is processed. So the EEG is full of ERPs. The ERPs don't have any EEG in them if they're averaged out well. On rare occasion, the timing of the task will end up matching up perfectly with somebody's background alpha, and your ERP will have an alpha-like wave that sits on top of it. And those can be fixed by changing inner stimulus intervals and stuff. But the task that's been set up here, the intervals and everything are picked based on lots and lots and lots of experience. So it's usually not a problem with this particular task, but there are people that set up tasks for P300s and stuff that end up having the inner stimulus interval matched up with somebody's alpha, and you can't get rid of the alpha in the waveform. But typically, again, the background EEG will average out of these. This is the response to a stimulus averaged up 100 times. So it slowly adds up and up and up and up and up as you repeat it. EEG slowly averages out and out and out and out and out as you repeat it. So ERPs are in the EEG, but EEG is not in the ERPs, assuming they're done well. Anyway, that's half an hour of discussion, and we just had Yuri step in here at the very, very end. Hopefully the recording will end up catching him up on this. But what we have is, again, a very complex interrelationship between the resting state EEG, which is your average resting background rhythm, eyes open and eyes closed, and the event-related potential, which is the brain's response to stimuli. There will probably be questions, I would hope. Anybody can unmute themselves, and now that we're done with the presentation, you can even turn on a camera, and we're able to share bandwidth in other ways. And I don't hear any questions, but I suspect people may be muted at this point too.
I have a question.
Speak up as well. I'm almost deaf.
Okay. The Loretta image on that graphic, the table of normative components, I assume that that's something that can only be compiled and represented as there's many people's data. Is that correct? There's no real-time individual representation like that showing brain activity, I assume?
No, we do it on the components themselves as well. The Loretta actually works very well with ERPs. You get a visual event-related potential. The 100 millisecond stuff hits at the back of the head. You do auditory. You can pick up the Loretta source can end up actually showing the initial sensory arrival in the auditory cortex. So these end up being things that you can end up showing on a case-by-case-by-case basis as well, and you'll show the deviation spatially for the generator compared to the normative generators. So there are times when sensory processing is okay on one hemisphere, but the other temporal lobe is blown out, and you'll see that lack of symmetry and a unilateral response to sensory processing. There'll be times that the people actually have a singlet problem, and regardless of the fact that they know in their mind's eye what the task is, they have to double check every single move that they just made, and they get these error responses going off and off and off, and you get this last component being a gigantic error response. Even when they behaviorally they're doing everything correctly, if they have an obsessive compulsive singlet, they can end up over focusing on every little response. Oh, was that right? And they get this little self-doubt error code going off. So you can literally see each of these components and the individual's response of those components.
Is there a neurofeedback application for something like that cingulate damage condition where they're
in fact, you can target the cingulate with feedback. Both, traditionally people had done surface feedback, assuming that they were influencing the cingulate, and they got cingulate-related behavioral change, contingent change on the feedback. So if you're feeding back to get rid of the alpha at the anterior midline, the assumption was that that may be influencing the cingulate, and sure enough, getting rid of alpha at the anterior cingulate area on the surface, they got a contingent behavioral change. Other people later said, well, we can use the Loretta to predefine an area and then feed it back. And that's actually been done very nicely. They've shown that it's capable of being done, and they got similar contingent behavioral responses, having not just stuck electrodes on the surface like one electrode at FZ with a couple of electrodes on the ears. You have to put on the full cap to get the Loretta solution to end up feeding it back. So, and it requires a 19-channel amp and thus more expense than a 1 or 2 channel EEG feedback device. So we know there's cost to it, but it's entirely possible to do it. The clinical yield on it hasn't been proven. It's been proven to work as a technique. You can feedback activity with Loretta and actually get feedback to occur. But there's nobody that's done OCD Loretta feedback specifically to show OCD is treatable with neurofeedback using Loretta. The ADD ADHD work has been shown to be good efficacy, but they don't have Z-score based feedback that's already gone through that level of proof as well. So there's a lot of new techniques that we have that are available and probably rationally based to try to use them. Some of them don't have the efficacy literature yet, but I mean, efficacy literature follows the clinical work, and we shouldn't be harnessed by, oh my God, it's an experiment, we can't do it. If it's an experiment, we should do it, but if we do it, we have to report our results. And that's what's missing at this point is the outcome results at a level that ends up supporting efficacy. But you can do ERP feedback. Technically, it's possible to do single trial feedback. Yuri Kropotov has set that up. You have to set up spatial filters and everything for the feedback. But once you set it up, you can do it. The difficulty is that training it doesn't seem to really get the same outcomes. Just because you can feed it back doesn't mean that they show learning curve well with it. So they've shown that you can feed it back, but it's not really something that appears to be malleable with feedback. The EEG, on the other hand, is as plastic as a pile of goo, Play-Doh. It's the EEG is operantly manipulable in a hugely variable way, which is good. I mean, if it wasn't highly variable, we'd probably all be stuck as in the cave still. So. Feedback of EEG can be done with independent components as well. In Europe, there are a lot of people doing ICA feedback. You predefine the component by analysis. Once you've defined the component, you can end up doing that as feedback. And that's an interesting approach because there are components that are transients that you really can't see. For instance, frontal midline theta. It's theta at the frontal midline. Spectrally, on an instantaneous basis, it would look very similar to excess theta that was frontal. which isn't the same thing. Frontal midline theta is healthy, normal memory function. It's a brief burst, less than a second long, at the frontal midline on a memory task. Now, theta all over the frontal lobe is like ADD. So, one is healthy, normal, and its spatial and temporal filter ends up being a very discrete burst. It's different than frontal theta. And ICA feedback can tap into the fact that this is a frontal burst as opposed to the ongoing theta in the frontal lobe and feed it back more specifically. So you don't necessarily turn off somebody's memory function as you're dialing down their ADD, for instance. So we're just now getting handed the tools, and there's some good rational basis to play with the tools. But if I invented a brand new hammer today, what the hell kind of hammer is it? Is it intended to pull nails out? Or is this a framing hammer intended to smash your thumb? Or is it a ball peen hammer intended to bend metal, or a tack hammer intended to make little itty bitty, tacks go into something? We'd have to play with it. A sledgehammer, what do we really have? Until we play with a hammer, we don't know what we can use it for. And, we've got a lot of brand new tools, and we should be using them to find out what they're good for and what they're not good for. When should we use them, and when should we not use them? When Z-score training came out, right initially, as soon as it came out as a possibility, I expressed concern over Z-scores when the tuning of the brain activity was very far out of the traditional bands, because you're getting Z-score feedback for banded activity. And if you're, let's say I have perfectly wonderful alpha at the back of my head at 10 hertz, and it's had a nice normal pattern at the back, nothing excess up front, nice coherent pattern at the back. And you could reach into my thalamus and change the polarization and slow it down to 6 hertz. And you could do that. I mean, thalamuses can go below 6, so 6, 7, really easy. The databases will tell you it's too big when it's just at 7 instead of 10. Same size, it's now too big. No, it's not. It's too slow. And it will tell you it's too coherent, but it's not. It's just not fast enough. It's comparing this rhythm at 7 that should be at 10, and it's telling us it's too big and it's too coherent, when that's really bad advice. You should speed it up. You shouldn't make it smaller and less coherent. Why mess with the thalamocortical network when it doesn't need to be messed with? What you really need to do is just speed it up a little bit. So Z-scores have strengths, but they have weaknesses too. And when your definition and frequency domain don't match up with the expectation of the database, you're going to get some really screwy advice. So I expressed that concern. I also suggested that not every deviation in a database is an abnormality. Last I knew, a statistician was not the same thing as a therapist. If you get a statistical deviation, you might have an abnormality, and it could really be abnormal, but it could also be a compensatory mechanism. It's not normal to be carrying crutches, but if you got a broken leg, you better have them. The brain has compensatory mechanisms. SMR frequencies, beta frequencies, they're very commonly used to compensate for another issue. And as such, if you see an outlier, you need to figure out, is this SMR a stabilizing rhythm that's trying to put the lid on the boiling pot here? There's too much of it, but is it a good thing or a bad thing? We just know that there's too much.
I wonder what extremely gifted individuals in different ways might look like comparing to statistical tables.
3 options: abnormal, compensatory, or a unique outlier state. Years ago, I ran a meeting for ISNR. I ran their meetings a lot. For a 10-year period, I ran 8 of their meetings. And I was running around the audience with a microphone. The panel discussion up front was all the people who own databases. And they were all going through describing all the features of their databases. And everybody was proud. I mean, these are, everybody had their little nuance to their database, but this wasn't an argument. This was everybody just kind of saying what they had. The time came to 5 minutes left in the scheduled time, and there were no more questions, and I had the microphone, which is a dangerous moment. I looked to the panel, and I looked in the audience, and I saw Roy John sitting on the aisle, And I said, you've just described normative databases. And I look out here in the audience and I see Roy John, and I tell myself, Roy's not normal. Roy's extraordinary. Why the hell would I want a database of normal when I could have a database of extraordinary? And I turned to the panel discussant, and they all just went, we have normative databases. It's a normative reference group. And there are unique outliers. And peak performance sports in the sports circumstance, if you see a world-class athlete and you've seen a whole bunch of them, you realize these are not normal, they're extraordinary. And some of them have abnormalities too. I mean, you can be a tremendous weightlifter and perhaps have ADD when it comes to school somehow. But you find your way into sports perhaps. So you see pathology in sports as well. And peak performance isn't necessarily training everybody to the mean. If peak performance was a mean-oriented state, they'd be more common. I mean, the normal Gaussian distribution, if you're at the mean, there's a lot of them. And unfortunately, that's just not really the case for peak performance. They appear to be unique outliers. And you can't take a peak performer for one sport and say this is the pattern of peak performers. You may get some traits that are loaded more heavily into one sport than another. At this point, the Australian Institute for Sports, which is their equivalent of the Olympic Committee here in the US, are testing elite athletes. They're recording EEG, QEGs, and ERPs on elite athletes. And they're hoping to gather enough knowledge from that to be able to guide people towards optimized brain function within their sport. Right now, there has been optimization in sports performance. Obviously, AC Milan quite a few years ago with the World Cup, they had a brain room for the year prior to that, and they largely attribute the self-regulation to having had the ability to get the win. If you remember that game, the intense person-to-person conflict in soccer is really astounding. And face-to-face, the athletes quite often taunt each other, and they're nasty, and you don't hear it on the camera usually, but there's a lot of stuff going on out there in the field. And towards the last part of the game, the opponent team, the guy finally got under his skin, and the guy headbutted him, and he was thrown out of the game. The star of the team was thrown out of the game, and their team just basically collapsed at that point. And the calm under fire of the AC Milan team was part of what kept them as winners. And Bruno, who was the coach that had the mind room for them, went to another team, and then they won. This has been replicated as a benefit to sports in a lot of teams. Recently, we saw the Super Bowl. I can't talk about individuals, but the winning team had a whole bunch of people that had neurofeedback, not just ex-players worried about head injuries, but current players looking to optimize function. So, the use of neurofeedback in sports to optimize the brain state is there. ERP may assess the wiring, but the background state in the EEG is also extremely important. That's more fruitful for feedback from what we can see. The ERP is much more fruitful for diagnosis. If you punch in event-related potential and diagnosis, you get a much bigger yield online than if you punch in QEG and diagnosis. And half the QEG and diagnosis things, they're arguing against it. So, the incidence isn't exactly the only way to look at it, but the ERP is very well accepted across a lot of areas for diagnostic application. The EEG, QEG is still arguable in a lot of areas.
Excuse me, Jay?
QEG is very useful, however. It may not be diagnostically specific.
Jay?
Yes,
Excuse me.
I saw you waving.
A number of people came in late and did not see the first slide you put up. Would you be kind enough to put up the first slide?
Sure. I had a couple of slides that were the actual raw potentials where you add all of the components together.
Go
Sensory
back
perception,
through.
processing, and so forth. This is the
This
go
is
potential.
raw
This is
EEG.
the no-go potential.
Yeah, go back 2 more slides.
Other than that, we had
It
the
was
EEG
the raw
frequency.
EEG that showed evoked potentials mixed in with it. And that's what I think a lot of people aren't familiar with looking at. It was the very first slide.
Well, I don't have a first slide. I have a bunch of slides, and I'm not sure which one I tossed up first.
This is raw EEG.
Okay, the raw
Showing
EEG
about
with
19 channel.
the features built into it.
That's it.
That's this. And
Would you be kind enough?
the EEG here ends up being a combination of ongoing rhythms and also event-related potentials. You can see here at the back of the head a little occurrence of lambda. You can see the waveform here within the head as a widespread distribution. This is the visual event-related potential, and it's embedded in the raw EEG. So the EEG is an ongoing mix of rhythms that are ongoing and events that are individual events. And as such, you don't see the individual events because they're not averaged up. You have to average. We typically see 100 of them averaged together to get a nice stable waveform. You can get by with 40, but you still have a noisy waveform. And at 100 repetitions, the EEG averages out, and the ERP averages up. And other than the raw waveforms, I then showed the raw waveforms of the waveforms of the ERP that are not dissected out into their component parts. This is the go and the no-go. And again, the go no-go potentials, when you look at them with respect to the database, here's the sensory detection of the stimulus, whether it's a go or a no-go. This is the sensory processing, whether it's a go or a no-go. You still have to figure out what the hell you're looking at. This is the auditory detection. This is the motor engagement. If this was a go stimulus and you hit the button, this is what did it. If you inhibited and didn't hit the button, this is what did it. And this is the self-monitoring component, which tells you if you made an error or not. It holds in the anterior cingulate a model of what you should be doing, and you compare your current behavior to that. If you get an error code, you get this component firing off. And step by step by step, this is the processing, and the adding of these waveforms together is what gives us these raw waveforms. So 100.
So what everybody, I hope, just saw. Hang on, Jay. What I'm hoping that everybody just saw was the difference in time that it takes to process this information. As Jay said, this is a sequence, and you can't see this on a raw EEG. So there is a real relationship between EEG and event-related potentials, but you've got to know what you're doing to see it.
Yeah. And
okay, so that was the part I wanted to emphasize.
The EEG is full of ERPs. They're hard to see, but they're there. And the ERP, if it's handled right, doesn't have EEG in it. That's a big difference. The EEG averages out. You basically see ERP only at 100 repetitions. Anyway, the intent was to toss out a little bit of information about EEG and ERP. The latency issue, again, is going to be a PhD dissertation coming out of the group. This is data that was presented. This is actually data from Martijn Arns when we did our work together in Europe. You can see this is normal EEG. slow and fast alpha, but in the study they had frontal slowing, beta spindles. We had other categories as well in the study. These are just the normal background alpha, fast and slow alpha. And again, 16 normals, 18 slow, and only 8 fast. So it's not a perfect study, but you can see it's not just an N of 1 or 2, and the latency is fairly easily identifiable even in this fairly small N.
Hey, Jay, I am dying to ask a couple of questions. Is this an okay time?
Well, if it's not a good time now, I don't know when it will be.
Okay, so for auditory processing, if you think about people who have tinnitus, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I don't have tinnitus. I'm just about deaf. That's all. Tinnitus can end up masking the ability to detect sound, and quite often tinnitus is due to hearing loss. Now, there are different kinds of tinnitus. You can have cortical irritability and have tinnitus, but classic tinnitus from hearing loss, there's a phenomenon called thalamic coherence. When you don't have the input to the auditory cortex, the thalamic column ends up slowing at the top of the column due to lack of input. And with the slowing, the area surrounding it creates gamma invasion when the lateral inhibition is gone. So the adjacent area sound actually invades, and the size of the gamma is linearly related to the intensity of the tinnitus. But what you have is a sound invading. This is the same as phantom limb, only this is phantom sound. And
so what would that do to the ERP?
The adjacent area basically invading. So you get a false input.
What does that do to the ERP? Does it slow the ERP then in individuals?
Well, if you've got hearing loss, it slows the alpha in the auditory cortex, and that's going to slow the processing speed in that area. Now, whether it slows it all or not is another matter. And you can end up having ERP latency issues that end up being localized. When you start to actually look at the topographic distributions in the components, you can start to sometimes see, a spatial shift. And if you have one auditory cortex that's at a different frequency, you end up with spatial distortion of the apparent generators. Probably the best work that's out there on tinnitus, the most complete work, is Dirk de Ridder, MD, PhD, labs in Belgium, but also in New Zealand, and he invented the implanting of electromagnetic stimulators to turn off phantom pain and phantom sound. And his model of understanding of tinnitus isn't just the sound, but also the emotional disturbance associated with it, the perseveration of the sound, all of those kind of things. Very, very complex model, but also very complete. It explains so much clinically. And if you're interested in tinnitus as a topic, he's your best expert. Also,
absolutely, I saw him at ISNR.
But he does DC, stim, neurofeedback, EEG, QEG, MRIs, CT, whatever you need to do. He's got all the toys. So.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, we're about out of time, folks.
Isn't that how it is?
Last moment for questions for Jay.
I just saw a
I'll be
comment
emailing
by. Let me.
you. Jay, what did you say?
I just saw somebody's comment here. Author manuscript available. There's actually human imaging of tinnitus in animal models. So there's some papers that were tossed up here by Kurt. This one doesn't happen to be Dirk de Ridder, but if you punch in tinnitus and Dirk de Ridder, you're going to end up with plenty of references. Anyway, I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to leave the meeting. If I click the other button, it'll end the meeting for everybody. So I'm just going to end up ducking out here in a moment. If there's any last moment question, I'd be happy to cover it.
Jay, thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure.
Enjoy
Enjoy your day, and hopefully you have a more positive things to do than just sit around and listen to me yapper. So we'll catch you another time around. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks, Jay.
You're the baby. You're the baby stuff.